The streets of Harlem were alive with movement. The honking of taxis, the rhythmic footsteps of pedestrians, and the distant echoes of a street performer's saxophone painted a familiar soundscape of the neighborhood. Welcome to Shadow Crime. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue creating even better content. Thank you so much. All right, let's get started. For Nathan Carter, this wasn't just a place he called home. It was the heart of everything he fought for. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, his tie neatly knotted, and his polished shoes tapping against the sidewalk, Nathan carried himself with quiet confidence. He was not just another man walking these streets. He was a name that carried weight, a renowned civil rights attorney, a man who had built his career fighting injustice and unknowingly about to become a victim of the very system he had spent his life challenging. Nathan Carter, defender of justice. Nathan had spent years tackling high-profile cases of racial discrimination, wrongful arrests, police brutality, unjust prison sentences. His reputation was built on holding power accountable. Yet, despite all his victories in court, he knew one harsh truth. No amount of legal expertise could shield a black man from racial profiling. Tonight would prove it. The wrong place. Just 2 blocks from his mother's home, Nathan walked toward his car. It was late, but he wasn't worried. This was his neighborhood. But to some, that didn't matter. A police cruiser pulled up. 2 officers inside. Sergeant Richard Wallace, a seasoned cop with a rigid view of the world. Officer Miguel Torres, younger, more hesitant, but still willing to follow orders. Wallace leaned out of the window, his eyes narrowing as he scanned Nathan up and down. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Nathan paused, his jaw tightening. He knew this script all too well. "Is there a problem, officer?" Yeah, we got reports of suspicious activity in the area." "You fit the description." Nathan let out a slow breath. "And what description would that be?" "A black man in a suit." Torres shifted uneasily, his grip tightening on his belt. He wasn't sure about this stop, but he wasn't going to question Wallace. "Just show us some ID." Nathan reached into his pocket slowly, retrieving his wallet. "Here, Nathan Carter, attorney." Wallace barely glanced at it. "That's supposed to impress me?" And just like that, Nathan knew. They weren't stopping a suspect. They were stopping a black man who they decided didn't belong. Sarah Ramirez, a different kind of cop. As tension thickened, a second police car pulled up. Lieutenant Sarah Ramirez stepped out, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. She was a seasoned officer, one of the few in the force who truly believed in reforming the system from within. "Wallace, what's going on here?" "Suspicious activity," Wallace muttered. "We're checking him out." Sarah's gaze flickered to Nathan, then back to Wallace. "Checking him out or profiling him?" Wallace scoffed, but before anyone could de-escalate, things took a sharp turn. The arrest that should never have happened. Nathan took a step forward, ready to leave. Wallace grabbed his arm. "Where do you think you're going?" "I told you, I'm an attorney. I'm not under arrest. I know my rights." "Yeah, well, I don't like your attitude." Before he could react, Wallace twisted his arm behind his back. Torres hesitated, but helped cuff him anyway. "You're under arrest for obstructing an investigation." The words felt like a slap. Nathan wasn't being arrested for a crime. He was being arrested for existing in the wrong skin. Sarah took a step forward. "Wallace, don't do this." "Too late," Wallace muttered. He had a chance to cooperate. Nathan locked eyes with her as they pushed him into the squad car. And in that moment, she knew. This wasn't just another wrongful arrest. This was a mistake that would cost the NYPD everything. The people who refused to stay silent. Emma Rodriguez, a longtime activist, heard about Nathan's arrest within the hour. By morning, she was organizing protests. Claire Nguyen, an investigative journalist, started making calls, preparing to expose the truth. And Eleanor Carter, Nathan's mother, stood outside the police station demanding to see her son. Because when you take away the freedom of a man like Nathan Carter, you don't just arrest him, you start a war. Or are you just playing dress up? Nathan's jaw tightened. He had spent years fighting for justice, but today, justice wouldn't fight for him. Torres shifted again, looking uncertain, but he didn't stop Wallace. He didn't say anything at all. Nathan took a slow breath, reining in the frustration bubbling in his chest. Officers, I know my rights. If you don't have probable cause, you have no legal authority to detain me. Wallace's smirk faded. That's so? Nathan saw it coming before it happened. Then open your trunk. Let's take a look inside. Nathan stood his ground. Not without a warrant. No probable cause, no search. Silence. A dangerous kind. Wallace's jaw tightened and his smirk twisted into something sharper. You want to play that game? Before Nathan could react, Wallace grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. Pain shot through Nathan's shoulder. Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing? Nathan gritted his teeth, refusing to struggle. You're resisting an investigation, Wallace sneered. Torres hesitated. Sarge, maybe we should stay out of it, Torres. And then Wallace shoved Nathan against the hood of his car. Metal against his chest, handcuffs snapping shut. Nathan Carter, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice. The arrest that started a war. Nathan Carter had spent his life fighting cases like this. But today, he wasn't the lawyer. He was the defendant. And as Wallace pulled him toward the squad car, Nathan didn't think about his reputation, his cases, or even his mother waiting for him at home. He thought about every other man who had been in his position. Every man who didn't have the law on their side. Every man who never made it out alive. But Nathan Carter, they arrested the wrong man because he wouldn't go down quietly. Or are you just playing dress up? Torres hesitated, shifting on his feet. He wasn't comfortable, but he wasn't stopping it either. Nathan felt his patience thin. I know my rights, and I know that if you don't have probable cause, you have no legal reason to detain me. Wallace's smirk faded. That's so? Then open your trunk. Let's take a look inside. Nathan stood his ground, not without a warrant. No probable cause, no search. Silence. A dangerous kind. Wallace's jaw tightened. You want to play that game? Before Nathan could react, Wallace grabbed his arm, twisting it back. Pain shot through his shoulder. Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing? Nathan gritted his teeth, refusing to struggle. You're resisting an investigation, Wallace sneered. Torres hesitated. Sarge, maybe we should stay out of it, Torres. And then Wallace shoved Nathan against the hood of his car, metal against his chest, handcuffs snapping shut. Nathan Carter, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice. The arrest that started a war. Nathan Carter had spent his life fighting cases like this. But today, he wasn't the lawyer. He was the defendant. And as Wallace pulled him toward the squad car, Nathan didn't think about his reputation, his cases, or even his mother waiting for him at home. He thought about every other black man who had been in his position, every man who didn't have the law on their side, every man who never made it out alive. But Nathan Carter? They arrested the wrong man because he wouldn't go down quietly. The cold, sterile air of the police station carried the same feeling Nathan Carter had spent his career fighting against. Indifference, power unchecked, injustice masked as law enforcement. He sat in a hard plastic chair, his wrists aching from the too tight handcuffs. He had represented hundreds of men in this very situation. He had seen the fear, the humiliation, the quiet resignation in their eyes. And now, for the first time, he understood it firsthand. Nathan Carter, Harlem's most prominent civil rights attorney, was sitting in a holding cell like a common criminal. The booking process, a show of power. Stand up. A gruff voice broke through the silence. Nathan was pulled to his feet. Flashes from the camera, fingerprints taken, personal belongings confiscated. He didn't speak. Not yet. He wanted to see how far they would take this. Sonner Richard Wallace, the officer responsible for his arrest, stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching the process like a man still convinced he had done the right thing. "Put him in holding until we figure out what to charge him with," Wallace barked. No probable cause, no charges. They were holding a man for nothing. Nathan let out a slow breath, keeping his composure as he was led into a small, cramped holding cell. The steel doors slammed shut behind him. And then everything changed. The moment they realized who he was, the station buzzed with mundane activity. Officers on phones, filling out paperwork, sipping coffee. Then came the footsteps. Fast, urgent, someone running. A young officer burst into the room, panting, his face pale. "Sarge," he called out, looking straight at Wallace. Wallace barely glanced up. "What?" he muttered, annoyed. "Do you know who you just arrested?" the officer demanded. Wallace rolled his eyes. "A guy who didn't follow police orders." "No, Sarge, a guy who could destroy this entire department." "That's Nathan Carter." Silence. Silence. Wallace froze. "Nathan Carter?" he repeated slowly, the name sinking in. "As in civil rights lawyer Nathan Carter? As in won multiple lawsuits against the NYPD Nathan Carter?" The young officer nodded, his breathing still heavy. "Yeah, that Nathan Carter." Wallace's face turned pale, because he knew in that moment he had made the biggest mistake of his career. Harlem fights back. While chaos erupted inside the station, an even bigger storm was brewing outside. Word of Nathan's arrest spread like wildfire. By the time Wallace realized his mistake, a crowd had already formed outside the station. Harlem had shown up, and they weren't leaving without Nathan Carter. Emma Rodriguez, a well-known community organizer and longtime ally of Nathan, stood at the front, a megaphone in hand. "We know why Nathan Carter is in there," she shouted. "This is not law enforcement. This is racial profiling." Beside her stood Eleanor Carter, Nathan's mother. She had lived through the civil rights movement. She had raised her son to fight for justice. And now she was here to demand it for him. "Let my son go," she yelled, her voice unwavering. You don't get to silence the man who fights for our people." The crowd roared in agreement. "Free Nathan Carter! Justice for Nathan!" The chants grew louder, the noise echoing through the streets. And then the media arrived. Cameras flashed, microphones were raised, news vans pulled up. Nathan Carter's arrest had just become national news. A crisis inside the station. Inside, Wallace paced the floor, rubbing his temples. "We have to get ahead of this," he muttered. "What do we charge him with?" Officer Miguel Torres, who had remained silent throughout, finally spoke up. "We can't charge him, Sarge. We had no reason to stop him in the first place, and now the whole damn city knows it." Wallace clenched his jaw, feeling the walls close in. He had made one bad decision. Now he was about to watch his career go up in flames. Nathan Carter sat calmly in his cell, listening. He could hear the chants outside, the rising voices, the tension building. They had arrested the wrong man. Now they had to deal with the consequences. Inside the police station, chaos churned like a storm. The media was outside, the protest was growing, and Sergeant Richard Wallace was running out of options. He could feel it. The weight of his mistake, the scrutiny of his officers, the inevitable downfall if he didn't find a way out. Then came the voice he didn't want to hear. "Wallace, we need to talk. Now." Trungui Sarah Ramirez stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression sharp and unyielding. She wasn't here to debate. She wasn't here to clean up Wallace's mess. She was here to end it. The confrontation. Wallace straightened his stance, masking his unease with arrogance. "What do you want, Ramirez? I want to know why the hell Nathan Carter is sitting in a holding cell right now." Silence. "I read the report," she continued, "and I don't see a single valid charge. So tell me, what exactly did he do wrong?" Wallace clenched his jaw, refusing to back down. "He refused to cooperate." "Cooperate?" Ramirez scoffed. "You mean he refused to let you violate his rights?" Torres, standing in the corner, looked away. He knew she was right. "Let me be clear," Ramirez said, stepping closer. "There's no probable cause, no outstanding warrants, no valid reason to hold him. If we keep him locked up any longer, We're not just breaking the law, we're setting this entire department on fire. Wallace's face burned with frustration. Ramirez, let him go. Now, Nathan walks free. The holding cell door swung open. Nathan Carter rose to his feet, his expression unreadable as two officers removed the cuffs. He had spent his career fighting for others in this exact situation. Now, he was the one walking out. As he stepped out of the station, the scene outside hit him like a wave. Hundreds of people, protesters, reporters, cameras flashing, and in the front, his mother, Eleanor Carter, waiting for him. She hadn't left, not for a second. She had fought for him the same way he had fought for so many others. Nathan exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment. Then he heard a voice behind him. Nathan. He turned. It was Sarah Ramirez. She stood firm, her eyes filled with something most officers refused to admit: accountability. We were wrong, she said. I was wrong, and I will do everything in my power to make this right. Nathan didn't answer right away. He just looked past her to Wallace, standing in the shadows, avoiding his gaze. Nathan saw it. The realization, the fear, the understanding that Wallace had finally lost control. And yet, Nathan knew this wasn't over. It wasn't about one officer or one wrongful arrest. It was about a system, a fight far bigger than just him. And this was just the beginning. Nathan Carter had spent years fighting for justice in the courtroom. But this time, the case was personal. Just days after his wrongful arrest, Nathan took action. He filed a lawsuit against the NYPD for unlawful detainment and racial discrimination. And this wasn't just about him. This was about every black man who had been stopped without cause, every innocent person who had been humiliated by the system, every voice that had been silenced by injustice. Nathan wasn't just seeking justice, he was demanding change. The power of the media. Emma Rodriguez and Clara Nguyen knew exactly what to do. Emma, the activist, took to the streets. Clara, the investigative journalist, took to the press. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Nathan Carter, renowned civil rights attorney, wrongfully arrested by NYPD, New York Times. The lawyer who fought the system, now the system is fighting him. The Guardian, interviews, news segments, social media campaigns. The NYPD had hoped to sweep this under the rug, but now the entire nation was watching. The fallout at the NYPD. With mounting pressure, the NYPD had no choice but to act. Sergeant Richard Wallace and Officer Miguel Torres were placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. Internal Affairs launched an official inquiry into racial profiling practices, and for the first time, high-ranking officials were forced to answer tough questions. But Wallace, he was still convinced he had done nothing wrong. This is political, he grumbled to fellow officers. They're making an example out of me. I was just doing my job. He still didn't get it, but the world was about to teach him a lesson. Harlem stands together. As Nathan prepared for the legal battle ahead, the people of Harlem refused to stay silent. Protests began outside the NYPD headquarters. That marches filled the streets. Signs read, "Justice for Nathan," "End racial profiling," "We are watching." Eleanor Carter, Nathan's mother, stood at the front. "This isn't just about my son," she told the press. "It's about every family that has lived in fear. We will not be ignored." And the world listened. The fight is just beginning. Nathan sat in his office, reviewing the case. This lawsuit wasn't just about winning It was about setting a precedent. It was about making sure no one else had to go through what he did. And as he looked at the growing movement outside his window, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a revolution. A courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the benches. Activists sat in silent anticipation. Community leaders from Harlem, politicians, and legal experts all gathered to witness a trial that could change everything. Nathan Carter versus the NYPD. It wasn't just about one wrongful arrest anymore. It was about holding the system accountable. It was about proving that racial profiling was real, that it had consequences, and that no badge was above the law. And today, the world would finally see if justice could be more than just an idea. Wallace's defense crumbles. Sergeant Richard Wallace sat stiffly at the defendant's table. For weeks, he had insisted he had done nothing wrong. I was following procedure. Carter was uncooperative. I did what any good officer would do. But today, those excuses wouldn't save him. Because today, the truth would be laid bare. The prosecutor rose, stepping toward Wallace with cold, precise confidence. Sergeant Wallace, let's talk about why you stopped Nathan Carter. Did you witness him commit a crime? No, Wallace muttered. Did you receive a report specifically naming him? No, but then tell me, Sergeant, why exactly did you target him? What made him so suspicious to you? Wallace hesitated. He fit the description. And what description was that? The prosecutor pressed. A black man in a suit? The jury watched intently. Wallace shifted in his seat. He had no answer, because everyone in that courtroom knew the truth. Nathan Carter was never a threat. He was never a suspect. He was just a black man in the wrong place, in front of the wrong cop. And now that cop was running out of excuses. The evidence that sealed the case. Then came the real blow. Video footage from a nearby store captured the entire arrest. Clear as day, it showed Wallace ignoring Nathan's ID. It showed Nathan complying, staying calm, even as Wallace escalated the situation. And it showed, without a doubt, that Nathan Carter was never a threat. The courtroom was silent as the footage ended. Wallace had no defense left. His career was over. And now he was about to face the consequences. The verdict that changed everything. The jury foreman stood. The entire room held its breath. In the case of Nathan Carter versus NYPD, we find the defendant, Sergeant Richard Wallace, guilty of unlawful detainment and racial discrimination. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Furthermore, the New York Police Department is found liable for civil rights violations. As a result, the NYPD will be required to compensate Mr. Carter for damages and enact mandatory anti-racism reforms. Sergeant Wallace and Officer Torres are officially dismissed from the force. Silence, then applause. Cheers from the crowd. History had just been made. A victory, but not the end. Nathan stood tall as he left the courthouse, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward him. He had won. The NYPD had been forced to change. But was this real justice? How many more men like him had suffered without cameras to prove their innocence? How many officers like Wallace had never faced consequences? And how many more battles lay ahead? Nathan turned to the reporters and spoke firmly. This isn't just about me. This is about every person who has ever been stopped, humiliated, or dehumanized because of the color of their skin. This is a victory, but the fight is far from over. We demand more than accountability. We demand change. The movement had started, and there was no stopping it now. Winning the lawsuit against the NYPD was a historic moment. But for Nathan Carter, it wasn't enough. Justice wasn't about one case, one verdict, or one officer losing his job. It was about systemic change, and he wasn't going to stop until real reform happened. From lawsuit to leadership, Nathan knew the police would never hold themselves accountable, so he decided to make sure someone else did. Together with Emma Rodriguez, the activist who had led the protests for his release, he launched the Justice Oversight Initiative, an independent organization dedicated to monitoring police misconduct. They had one goal: to make sure that officers like Richard Wallace were exposed before they ruined more lives. The organization quickly grew. Lawyers, activists, and former officers joined forces to collect evidence, represent victims, and fight for real police accountability. They weren't just demanding change, they were making it happen. An ally on the inside. Trungwe Sarah Ramirez had always believed in justice, but after witnessing what happened to Nathan Carter, she realized the NYPD was beyond saving from the inside, unless someone was willing to fight. So she made a decision. She would help expose the corruption within the department. Using her position, she gathered evidence of internal misconduct, secret reports of racial profiling that had been ignored, officers with multiple excessive force complaints still patrolling the streets, funds meant for police training being redirected into personal bonuses. She handed it all to Nathan and the Justice Oversight Initiative. If we want change, we have to rip this system open and force them to face it, she told him. And she meant it. Exposing the truth, Clara Nguyen's investigation. While Nathan and Ramirez worked on policy reform, journalist Clara Nguyen was doing what she did best: uncovering the truth. She dug through police records, interviewed whistleblowers, and exposed even more cases of racial discrimination and abuse. Her articles became the catalyst for a bigger movement. The public could no longer ignore the reality of what was happening. And soon, the pressure became too much for lawmakers to ignore. The birth of the Police Accountability Act, the movement reached City Hall. Protests turned into policy demands. Nathan, Emma, and a coalition of activists met with New York legislators to push for real reform. And after months of relentless pressure, it happened. New York passed the Police Accountability Act. Key changes included the creation of an independent community oversight board with power to investigate police misconduct, mandatory body cameras for all officers with public access to footage, a database tracking complaints against officers, preventing bad cops from being rehired. For the first time, the people had power over the police, not the other way around. The fight is far from over. Nathan stood outside City Hall, surrounded by supporters, as the law was signed into action. This is a victory, he told the crowd. But the fight isn't over. Laws don't enforce themselves. Change doesn't happen overnight. We must stay vigilant, stay loud, and never stop holding those in power accountable. Because justice wasn't just about a law on paper. It was about the people making sure it was followed. And Nathan Carter wasn't going anywhere. The battle for justice had only just begun. Nathan Carter had become a symbol of justice, the lawsuit, the protests, the reforms. He had won battles that many thought were unwinnable, but with victory came enemies. Not everyone wanted change. Not everyone wanted the system to be held accountable, and some were willing to do whatever it took to silence him. And a shadow started with subtle warnings. Stay in your lane. You're making powerful enemies. Watch your back, Carter. At first, Nathan ignored them. Threats weren't new to him. He had been fighting injustice for years. He knew fear was the weapon of the weak. But then, one night, it got personal. Nathan was working late at his office, reviewing documents for a new case against the NYPD. As he stepped outside, something felt wrong. The street was quiet. Too quiet. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A black SUV parked across the street. The engine was running, the headlights flicked on. Nathan's pulse quickened. He wasn't just being watched. He was being followed. A message of fear. The next morning, a letter arrived at Nathan's office. No return address, no signature, just a single warning. Stop now or there will be consequences. A chill ran through him. This wasn't just some online hate message. This was real. And whoever sent it knew exactly where to find him. He took the letter straight to Emma Rodriguez and Lieutenant Sarah Ramirez. Emma read it once and set it down, her jaw tightening. This isn't just a threat, she said. It's a promise. Ramirez crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. Nathan, you're shaking the foundation of something bigger than you realize. There are people in power who don't want you exposing the cracks in the system. And those people, they don't play fair. Nathan exhaled slowly. He knew they were right. He knew what was at stake. But stopping now? That wasn't an option. The choice to keep fighting. If I walk away, nothing changes, Nathan said, his voice steady. If I stop, they win. And if they think fear will silence me, they don't know who they're dealing with. Emma and Ramirez exchanged a glance. They saw it in his eyes. Nathan wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for survival, and he wasn't backing down. Years of relentless struggle, years of threats, victories, and setbacks, years of refusing to be silenced. And now, the system had changed. Nathan Carter's fight had reshaped New York's justice system in ways once thought impossible, a new era for justice. The Police Oversight Board was no longer just a name, it had power. Every officer accused of misconduct was investigated. No more cover-ups, no more internal brotherhood shielding bad cops. Community members had a seat at the table, ensuring the people policed had a say in how it was done. For the first time, police officers were held accountable. Abuse of power resulted in real consequences. Unlawful arrests led to immediate reviews. Excessive force, officers were fired, not reassigned. And the biggest shift, mandatory racial bias training became standard. No more excuses, no more "I didn't know." Now, they had to know. New York had become a model for police reform, inspiring movements across the country. And at the center of it all, Nathan Carter. Expanding the movement. What began as a fight in Harlem spread nationwide. Nathan launched the Justice Reform Initiative, JRI, a national organization advocating for police accountability in every state. He traveled city to city, working with lawmakers, training officers, and exposing corruption. One by one, states followed New York's lead. New policies were passed. Oversight boards were established. Police culture began to shift. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. A national symbol of justice. Nathan Carter was no longer just a lawyer. He was a symbol, a leader, a movement. His name became synonymous with justice and reform. Activists quoted his speeches. Young law students looked up to him. Even politicians sought his advice. He had done what many thought impossible. He had changed the system from within. But his greatest honor came years later. A monument to change. In the heart of Harlem, a new statue was unveiled. A bronze figure of Nathan Carter standing tall, one hand holding a book of law, the other raised as if still leading the fight. A permanent reminder of the war he had waged and won. As the crowd gathered, cameras flashing, speeches being made, Nathan stood beside his mother, Eleanor Carter. She looked up at the statue of her son, her eyes glistening with pride. "You did it, Nathan. You changed the world." Nathan took a deep breath, taking in the moment. But deep inside he knew the fight wasn't over. There was still more work to do. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And he wasn't done yet. Nathan Carter's fight for justice teaches us profound lessons about courage, accountability, and the power of collective action. His journey is not just about one man standing against a broken system. It is a reminder that real change requires persistence and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Racial inequality doesn't always show itself in obvious ways. It can be subtle, like a glance, an assumption, or an unfair decision that goes unnoticed by many. Nathan's experience shows us that these injustices must not be ignored. Awareness is the first step toward change, but it takes a commitment to act on that awareness for true progress to occur. The fight for justice is never easy, and it often comes with personal risk. Nathan faced threats, intimidation, and attempts to silence him, yet he did not back down. This reminds us that standing up for what's right can be difficult, but it is in these moments that we find our true strength. His perseverance, even in the face of adversity, highlights the importance of never compromising your values, no matter how powerful the opposition may seem. Systemic change takes time. While one victory, like the passing of the Police Accountability Act, is important, the work doesn't end there. Real change requires continuous effort and vigilance. This applies not just in cases of injustice, but in all aspects of life, whether in our personal relationships, communities, or in the larger world. The fight for fairness, respect, and equality requires ongoing commitment. We all have a role in building a better society. Whether we are activists, voters, or just concerned citizens, our collective efforts shape the world. Never underestimate the impact of one individual. Nathan's work, supported by those around him, proves that a single voice, when paired with determination and a commitment to justice, can inspire a movement that reverberates across generations. For all of us, the lesson is clear. The fight for justice and equality is a lifelong journey. It takes courage, community, and continuous action. And just as Nathan led the way, so too can each of us help create the change we want to see in the world.